everyone. I'm Elizabeth Goldstein, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm the president of MAS, and I am delighted to welcome you to our program, Essential New York. Tonight's program was inspired in part by our recent Jane's Walk NYC From Home Festival, where we partnered with Subway Therapy and City Lore to gather a collection of observations and stories about essential places that make New York, New York. The ones we cherish and miss the most while we're staying at home. And why? From the bodega to your corner block, to a beloved community garden or a local bakery, New Yorkers shared hundreds of spaces that collectively weaved meaning and memory into the fabric of our city. Since then, the pandemic and the structural deficiencies it exposed in our medical system have been compounded by tragic losses of human life that have stirred the embers of the fight to correct racial injustice. It has affected us all profoundly. Governments that we had hoped would protect us have failed us. We are in a kind of free fall where the body blows of crisis keep coming. We are threatening the basic tenets of our democracy, our ability to vote and to exercise free speech. For most of us, the barriers to connecting to our friends, our communities, and our city itself has been even more frustrating. However, in the midst of this, sprout seedlings of healing. I grew up in a Mitchell-Lama housing project in the Bronx. It was a neighborhood of teachers, firemen, nurses, clerical workers, and their families. Black, Puerto Rican, and Dominican families seeking a safe, healthy, and fulfilling communities for themselves and their family. It was a time of great tragedy and great flowering. The Bronx, which was a collection of largely stable, lower middle class and poor neighborhoods when my parents moved there in the early 60s, have been devastated by public and private policy that resulted in large swaths of the Bronx literally being burned to the ground. And yet, side by side with that destruction, and in many cases because of it, grew a racial justice and community empowerment movement that resonates today, and a flowering of cultural expression that has changed the face of America and the world, such as hip hop and graffiti art. It was a historic moment, much like today, where the fissures and tensions of the city and its interwoven power dynamics were exposed for the world to see and to act to correct, and sometimes not. We undertook our partnerships with Subway Therapy and City Lore not only because of the need to pivot to a virtual Jane's Walk, but also because of MAS's long-term commitment to celebrating the New York we know and love. As part of our recent efforts to think about where MAS should focus its work in the coming years, we have envisioned a future in which all New Yorkers share in the richness of city life, where growth is balanced, character endures, and a resilient future is secured. As E.B. White put it in Here is New York, the city makes up for its hazards and its deficiencies by supplying its citizens with supplementary vitamins, the sense of belonging to something unique, cosmopolitan, mighty, and unparalleled. We hope to work with all of you and many people not in this virtual room to define what is essential New York. It will be a long and sometimes difficult journey, but it will have great rewards along the way. Thank you again for joining us today for this emotional unpacking of the importance of place, especially in this tumultuous time. In a moment, I will introduce Mindy Thompson Fullilove, Matthew Chavez, and Molly Garfinkel. But before we start, there are a few things that I would like to note. In the chat box to the right, you can comment and ask questions, and our panelists will take time towards the end to answer your questions and may pose prompts for our audience to respond to throughout the program. We have also added some tips in the chat for your reference. Throughout the program today, you will see buttons at the bottom of your screen that will open additional information or links to resources. These links will open in a new tab on your browser, so even after you've closed the program, they will remain. You can also adjust your view, such as expanding to full screen or by collapsing the chat box by using the arrow tools on the top of this page. Our program today is anticipated to run about 90 minutes and is being recorded. The recording will be available later on our YouTube channel. Now, as we kick off the program, feel free to say hello and share where you are joining us from. It is now my pleasure and honor to introduce our speakers. First, Mindy Thompson Fullilove, who has many initials behind her name. She is an MD, LFA-PA, and Honorable AIA. She is a social psychiatrist and professor of urban policy and health at the New School. And since 1986, she has conducted research on AIDS and other epidemics of poor communities with a special interest in the relationship between the collapse of communities and decline in health. From her research, she has published numerous articles, book chapters, monograms, and books. Her forthcoming book, Main Street, How a City's Heart Connects Us All, will be released in October 2020. Matthew Chavez, the creator of Subway Therapy and Art Plus People. Subway Therapy is an ongoing immersive project in subway stations in New York that received the 2017 Brendan Gill Award and earned Chavez the Demos Transferring America Award. He recently started Art Plus People to support innovative participatory public projects. As an author and speaker, Chavez aims to empower and inspire others. He works part-time as a teaching artist at The Door, an organization that provides transformative youth development for the underserved in New York City. And finally, Molly Garfinkel, who is the director of the City Lore's Place Matters program. At City Lore, Molly leads projects related to cultural resource management, historic preservation, public history, traditional arts, cultural landscapes. Her research has explored global building transitions, theories of cultural landscapes, and the history of urbanism and city planning. Molly has published articles in the University of Oregon's Culture Works Broadside Voices, the Journal of New York Folklore, the University of Pennsylvania LA Plus Design Journal, and the Journal of American Folklore. She holds a BA in art history from Wesleyan University and an MA in architectural history from the University of Virginia. And now I would love to turn this program over to Mindy and your capable hands. Thank you all.
Elizabeth, I know that Matthew, Molly, and I are all excited to be here and to get started, but we know that we come together at a moment, as Elizabeth was saying, of, I think, horror and watching the disintegration of our society, watching a wealthy, supposedly decent society fail its people and let, so far, 160,000 people die unnecessarily. The headline in The Guardian last week, one of the headlines was Crisis on Crisis, and there was also a headline in the New York Times, Pile-up of Disasters. These are really very difficult times. After 9/11, the NYC Recovers Choir, which is now the Peace of Heart Choir, premiered its theme song, New York Has the Power to Heal Us All. And I believe that what we're here to unleash is that power. How can New York heal us all? And I'm so delighted to be here with Matthew. Matthew, you helped us all after November 8th, 2016. Can you take us back to that moment and what we had to say, how we prophesized this moment?
Sure. Hey, everyone. It's so wonderful to be here. I just want to say I'm so honored to be on this panel with Mindy and Molly. And I, for some of you that don't know, I do participatory public works in interesting spaces. One of those spaces is the New York subway. And about 4 years ago in 2016, after the election, I brought out a bunch of sticky notes into the subway and invited people to express themselves. And, you know, I think something that would be really wonderful now before I get into, you know, the notes and what people said and how it was an interesting forecasting of what's happened over the last 4 years. I would like to just know how everyone's doing. So if everybody could write into the chat how you're feeling, what thoughts are coming up. Did you bring a feeling with you into this moment? Feel free to just write whatever you like. We're going to take like 30 seconds and we'll have a period of just thinking time. And I want you to write out what you're feeling in the chat. And I'm going to do that too. I would invite everybody just to read what other people are saying. There's a great power in understanding others through reading and through that experience. And so let's do that in the chat now for the next, minute or so. I see a lot of thoughts of maybe feeling a little tired. I see optimism for the future. Uncertain, hot, sweaty, and unsettled. I see unconnected, but okay. I think a lot of people are feeling that way right now. Bernadette, I'm happy that you're curious about subway therapy and enthused. Amazing. Let's get your last thoughts in. And then in about 15 seconds, we'll continue on. And feel free to keep writing while I'm talking if things are coming up. But we're going to also check in later on. And I think it'll give us a good idea of how people are feeling now and if thoughts are coming up. If you're interested in learning more about subway therapy, you can click the link that just showed up. So I'm going to start talking about the sticky notes. Again, in 2016, I wrote "Express Yourself" and nothing else. It was just that. And around 50,000 people wrote on sticky notes. It started in 14th Street, 6th Avenue, spread to Union Square, and then went to a bunch of different places in Oakland, in Boston, and all sorts of other environments nationally, and a few places internationally, but I heard the one in Canada got shut down really quickly. This is at Union Square. At any given time, there's about 20,000 notes that anybody could read. They had all sorts of different thoughts represented. The vast majority, and this is, I think, what made it so viral and so memorable for many people, they were just about support and about loving each other and being there for each other. And that was reflected in, 80%, 85% of the notes were about New York being a safe haven, or about letting us stand together against hate and to be brave. And as someone who just showed up to try and be there for people that didn't have an outlet for expression, it evolved into this incredible mosaic of human expression that I couldn't have really imagined at that time. And it was wonderful to see people sharing thoughts of hope, thoughts of support, thoughts of, how do we create change and action in our communities? But then also people were very candid about how they were feeling. As you can see, there's a note that says, "This has been the worst year of my life." And there was an incredible pouring out of people's feelings as they were coming up during that time. And artists did a lot of different work like this. If you look at some of these, you probably can't read them, but some of them, an artist sat in front of this, wall of sticky notes and wrote images or drew images of people and then talked about what they were fighting for. And at the time, people were fighting for peace, and people were fighting for justice, and people were fighting for racial equality. And it was interesting to see at this time that there was a lot of, this is 2016, Trump had just been elected. This is the day after and the following month. It was really interesting to see some of the same messaging that people still feel now, which is not something that I'm super surprised by based on how things were going then. But it was interesting it has been interesting to do these types of projects in public space and to see people talking about the Black experience, talking about racial injustice then, and talking about all the work that was going to be important to do, and then to have that work either be done in certain areas, but not done in a way that macro allowed us to change as a nation. You know, really what it sounds like is it sounded like a projection of what was to come. A lot of the fears and anxieties that were represented on the wall there ended up being represented in the actions and then the thoughts of different people. And so as a framework, that's been really interesting in terms of how do we do the work and what is the work? How do we allow different communities to express themselves? And how do people like me who create works in public space or create outlets for expression, when people are expressing themselves, how do we take these words and thoughts and then create action out of them, or find perceived needs and then serve those needs so that we can benefit the community? This is one of my favorite notes of all time, and I think that it has become a mantra for me because I think it's really wonderful. It reads, "I don't understand, but I will try. We need each other." And I think this echoes different messages that I've heard over my entire lifetime. And for me, I've always been forgiving, and it's been okay for me to think to myself, I am really not sure what's happening right now, but I'm going to try. And I believe the most important thing is connection. One of the really wonderful videos that I watched recently in thinking about these talks was Mindy talking about the different fractures between rich and poor people in cities. And she said, we can heal by connection. And you know, what we really need to do to fix these divides between different groups is to find that connection. And so that's sort of something that I've been doing and I'm still extremely interested in doing in the future. One of the ways that I've been doing that is by partnering with really wonderful organizations and people that want to learn and be curious and figure out what elements make public space so important and essential, or private space. You know, like what are the things that make space so important for people to thrive in? And so we did a project for Jane's Walk, a virtual experience because I couldn't go out and do things in public like I normally do. And we invited people just to answer, what's your favorite place in New York City and why? I did this in an apartment that I was staying in at the time. And these are some of the notes that came up. I worked with two wonderful illustrators, Tanya Shika and Andy King, and we basically had people write in, say what they liked about a space, and then some of them got illustrated. It was a really wonderful project that allowed me, someone who hadn't always thought about what people really like about space, to think about what they enjoyed about it, what elements were really important to them. And that's become a really wonderful framework to think about. And I think Mindy or Molly is going to jump in and talk a little bit more about that.
It's actually, I was going to jump in.
Great.
Oh, thank you so much. It's very, very moving to see this and to think about that moment and how much those Post-its meant in November 2016. What a terrible time. And it helps us realize that we can feel better. We can help each other. So thank you very much. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about some thoughts I want to add to the conversation from my own work. Elizabeth mentioned that I have a book on Main Street that's coming out in October. And so I want to talk a little bit about one of the things that we found out about Main Streets in the course of our research. And I think it will help us understand a little bit more about when we know all these places, everybody has their own favorite place, what do we do with it? I am a psychiatrist, as Elizabeth mentioned, and the study of the environment is not a big part of the training of psychiatrists. So when I became interested in the ways in which urban policies were causing disease, I realized I had to learn about cities. And I happened to meet a French urbanist architect, Michel Cantal-Dupart, and he said he would teach me. And so this is Cantal, who came to visit me and helped me with projects I was working on. I went to France and hung out and learned about his projects. And so he was a great teacher and taught me about a lot of the work that he had done over the years. So one of the stories that he told me, a very important story in his own career, was of a project called Banlieues 89, which is Suburbs 89. It was a project in which he and other urbanists recognized that the way France had built housing projects for new immigrants had been in a complete rupture with the old form of the city, thus putting all the newcomers at a disadvantage and disconnected from the life of the city, from the life of France. This, he said, was explosive and terrible and would not support the healthy functioning of the nation. And he was able to get the president of France, François Mitterrand, to support this project. So it was a national project. And the idea was to look at the greater Paris region, and in that region to, and you notice this is the greater Paris region, but you don't see Paris. And that is a very important part of it, to say this is a big region. And one of the things they did was to say, where are the elephants? Which is the term they invented for things that people loved. And so these little dots are really elephants. And you see they're scattered all over the region. And the idea was that the way you build is to build on the things that are precious now. But part of the building is that you have to recognize the old disconnections and make new connections. And thank you, Matthew, for lifting up that I always talk about connections, and connections are between people, but connections also have to be made between places. So in our work in Main Streets, my colleague Jake Eisenberg found this map of the streets of Essex County, New Jersey. And you can see it's kind of a spaghetti of streets. And what's important about this, we thought in reflecting on it, is that they're all the streets are tangled up together. So you don't know from this map where are the poor neighborhoods, where are the rich neighborhoods. You can't tell. But we had done other work going to all the cities in Essex County, New Jersey, and looking at their main streets and trying to figure out what makes main streets work. What I want to say in this moment is that if you look in the center of the county, you'll see that there are these black ovals, which are for what we called the high hospitality main streets, meaning they were really fun to go there. There was a lot of stuff, and there were a lot of people there. The thing about the high hospitality main streets is that they weren't necessarily in rich neighborhoods or rich cities. There were rich cities that had no main street because they'd been built in a time when main streets had fallen into disrepute and people just wanted malls in their city. And there were main streets in poor neighborhoods that were fabulous, like the best main streets in Essex County. So it's not entirely about rich or poor. It's more complicated than that, which was interesting to us. But even more important is that not every main street is a high hospitality main street. And it's this stratification that disconnects our whole society so profoundly, and is one of the sources Cantal taught me of our dysfunction. And I just wanted to show a picture of one of the elephants, Bragman's Deli Restaurant Catering, which has fabulous pastrami and corned beef in Newark, New Jersey. But you can see in the inset picture that it's on a street that's largely closed up. It's not a high functioning main street. It's fallen on hard times. So Bragman's is there as a fabulous place to go. I mean, if you like pastrami, you would want to go to Bragman's. But it's all by itself on that street. And so the forces that move people around wouldn't normally move people to that spot. And that's the fracture of our society. That's the geography of fracture. And that's really the geography of every illness, every problem that we have. I'm part of a Free People's University of Orange in Orange, New Jersey, which is in Essex County. And we have 4 principles of restoration urbanism, that there's never nothing there. And when you see a street like the one Bragman's is on, it's not true that there's nothing there, because stores are closed. People would say there's nothing there, but it's never true. We also think that everything we need is already here. People might look at a problem and say, oh, we'd better get a such and such from someplace else. We like to start from the assumption that everything we need is already here. We must fight racism, and we must keep the whole city in mind. So using those principles, and in this moment, we have been saying, how do we understand this disconnection? How do we work with this disconnection? And we know that we have this disconnection at every level of scale. For example, Elmhurst Hospital in Queens was in terrible trouble for supplies, whereas some of the other wealthier hospitals, for example, Long Island Jewish, was not in terrible trouble for supplies during the real intense period of the COVID pandemic. And that has to do with the distribution and access to resources. But one of the things we know about all of this little fracturing of every city is that there are organizations in every piece. Organizations in Queens, organizations in Manhattan, everywhere. More organizations than we can count. And the organizations have the capacity, and in their daily life, they connect to each other, they connect to communities, and they connect to policymakers. Just as Elizabeth said, she connected to City Law, and she connected to Subway Therapy to do a Jane's Walk virtually. Organizations connect to each other and they solve problems. And that's a super example of what all of us can do, and many of us are doing in this terrible moment. So one of the artists and designers that we work with redrew the scientific diagram that my research team had created to say that the organizational level is expansive and powerful. So we are not helpless. We do have a crazy government, and we do have a terrible pandemic, but we are not helpless. And can we get this middle layer of organizations where we have a lot of power? Can we get it to take on the issues? Now, one of the things I want to say is that the US was very slow to shut down in March, but the shutdown really started when the NBA canceled its season and South by Southwest canceled its assemblage. There was organizations that moved powerfully in that moment to change the dynamics. One of the great experiences that I had in the aftermath of 9/11 was working with the Municipal Arts Society on Imagine New York. The Municipal Arts Society used its power of convening to call many organizations from all over the city and to say, we need to ask the people, what do they want to see? How are they doing? What do they want to see? What do we need to repair to come back stronger? It was an amazing experience to work on that project, and I learned a huge amount. And I think that what's essential in this period is that organizations that have that convening power, like the Municipal Arts Society, begin to convene us so that we can make the change that's needed. The New York Times had an op-ed yesterday that in 6 weeks we could shut this thing down by October. But we know that federal leadership is not going to do that. But that doesn't necessarily mean we're out of the game and have to endure this for an infinite amount of time. If organizations like the Municipal Arts Society were to convene all the organizations that they know, they could do what needs to be done. I just want to share 2 of the posters from Cantal's project, Banlieues 89, which was about going into all kinds of areas of France and looking at the ways in which the housing projects that were housing immigrants from basically all the colonies were disconnected from the urban form, and figuring out how to put those together. And they use the joy of the city. So, Banlieue 89, La Tour des Villes, and Fête des Forts. They use the existence of an old chain of forts, the perimeter of the Greater Paris region. Say, let's have a party at every one of those forts. So there are an unlimited number of ways to think as we think about what do we love in New York, to name the elephants and to find the connections and to lift spirits by invoking the joy that we have of the city, and to do what needs to be done to shut this thing down so we don't have COVID for the rest of our lives. If we could do it in 6 weeks, but we have a crazy president, who can do it? It is the organizations. And who can convene the organizations? I contend that the Municipal Arts Society is one of the groups that can convene the organizations. I know, Elizabeth, I just put a lot on your plate, forgive me. But we're all going to come help. So with that, Molly, in your work on Stories of Cities, you've been fighting for preservation, not just as bricks and mortar, but more. And can you tell us more about what the city is? What is this power that we're going to call on to heal us all?
And thank you very much to Matthew and to everybody at MAS for having me here today. So my name is Molly Garfinkel, and I'm here from an organization called City Lore, which was founded in 1985. We're what we call a cultural conservation nonprofit. Our mission is to foster New York City and sort of by extension, America's living cultural traditions in education and public programs. We document, present, and advocate specifically for New York City's grassroots culture to ensure their living legacies in stories and histories, places, and traditions. Our work really spans urban folklore, public history and historic preservation, arts and community-based education, poetry and language projects. And each of these, we aim to further the cultural equity that we know we can achieve in the city and this country, and try to model a better world with projects as dynamic and diverse as the city itself. And I direct what is called the Place Matters program, which is a 22-year-old initiative that was founded in collaboration with MAS that helps to celebrate and advocate and find ways of protecting, preserving, conserving, and speaking out for places all across the city, specifically places that the public finds significant. And these are the places that hold memories, anchor traditions, and help to tell the history of New York, and also help to make connections and bring us together. The backbone of the Place Matters project is the Census of Places that Matter, which you can find on our website. It is an encyclopedia and guidebook and compendium of hundreds and hundreds of places that New Yorkers and New York aficionados have nominated over the last 2 decades that help us to have a sense of the kinds of places that people care about, what they consider to be essential, the places that they find connection. And I highly encourage you to nominate a site. You don't have to be, you don't have to consider yourself an expert. We consider you an expert. If you go to our website and scroll down on the homepage, you'll find the nominate button. And we'd love to hear from you. And we look at all different kinds of places. We look at what we call really community anchors. Those are the spiritual centers, the social clubs, the small businesses that really help to keep communities together, that incubate tradition, that protect communities and the communities protect. We look at everything from really iconic high style markers in the landscape to the most quotidian places that really help us to have a sense of community and a sense of joy and release in the city. And in April, we collaborated with MAS, as has been mentioned, on Jane's Walk from Home, and asked communities across the city and the country to let us know what were the essential places, the places that they were relying on in that moment in April and May and March, and the places that they missed and the ones that they couldn't wait to come back. And we got over 50 nominations, and you are still welcome to make a nomination for an essential place. We got everything from historic institutions to beloved small businesses and nonprofits, to a very large number of open spaces and green spaces. And not surprisingly, of course, at that time, this was what really people were relying on. These were the places to connect with nature, to have time to yourself that felt safe, but also you could see the rest of humanity. You could see yourself as part of a larger ecosystem. These were the places that we could stop and take a pause, take a breath, see the world is still there and still churning and working, and that it would likely be there by the time we came out of our houses. And after May, the conversation about public space really shifted. And it's, as Kirsten wrote in the notes, open spaces are the places that enable people to thrive. And they're the places that enable us to find connection. And they're the places that enable us to mark our right to the city, our right to be able to stake claim to space, to make our presence known, to make our voices heard. And in the wake of the death of George Floyd, the killing of George Floyd, and numerous others across the country, New Yorkers really rolled out to the city's public spaces and relied on them for this critical moment of foment and connection. So we had everything from encampments at City Hall Park to bike rallies that are continuing throughout the city, to public art on surfaces across the city. This is the Williamsburg Bridge. This is a actually private property fence, the exterior in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. And it got me thinking about all of the ways that people across the city and across time have nominated and shared with us the ways that they care about public places. And this is also a way, public places are, and public spaces and surfaces are a way for people to use art to connect with each other, to self-represent, to promote their integrity, their existence, their right to the city again, their cultural traditions, their histories. In a lot of communities where we don't have the opportunity to spend money on political campaigns or media representation, these are the ways that people have represented in the city. So everything from murals across the city, public art, to ephemeral ways of marking territory in an artful way. This is actually a City Lore Poemobile event at the New York and Poets Cafe, where we project poems in numerous languages that are animated on the sides of buildings. Like Martin Espada, the poet, wrote "A white wing brushing the building." It's another way of marking space in an ephemeral and very beautiful way. Also the ways that public space helps to incubate and protect culturally specific traditions, and how those traditions help to enliven spaces and create connections amongst us. The Feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, the annual Giglio Fest, this was the very first year that wasn't able to take place in many decades in Brooklyn. The ways that the Federation of Black Cowboys were able to represent through clothing, through foodways traditions, through horsemanship, in a publicly owned park, a Parks Department owned space in Howard Beach. Unfortunately, they lost their space in 2016. They were outbid by by another, actually equestrian organization, but in a process of blind bidding for the first time since the early 90s. But for many years, they were able to represent a part of Black culture that most people are not necessarily familiar with. Grand Bois is a place in the southwest corner of Prospect Park, where since 1994, members of the Haitian community have gathered every Sunday from the beginning of May to mid-September to play music, to drum, to dance, to sing, and to make cultural connections and strengthen those connections. If you didn't know it was there, you wouldn't know it was there. Many years ago, there was a totem and a series of circular logs that the drummers would use as seating for the drum circle. Those were surreptitiously taken away overnight. We're not entirely sure by whom or why. And increasingly, sort of across the city, access to permits for space cultural events and public spaces is increasingly complex and difficult. But the folks who gather for Grand Bois and an annual event in August called Bois Caïman, which is an annual commemoration of the start of the Haitian slave revolution, is a really important event. And this is a place that they've staked a claim to through these sort of ephemeral activities, but these coming together, these connection making, even if it's not in a bricks and mortar kind of way. And a project that we've been working on at City Lore for a very long time, it sort of combines all of these elements. It looks at what are called casitas, which are bungalows built by Puerto Rican communities across historically Puerto Rican neighborhoods in New York City, so primarily in the Bronx, East Harlem, and the Lower East Side. These are built often on community gardens or what were vacant or abandoned properties. You know, the narrative of the Bronx was that it had burned and that there was nothing left. But of course, as Mindy said, there's never nothing there. Communities have deep roots and connections in these neighborhoods, and culture is a really big way of activating and relying on those connections and using them as leverage to not only keep yourself in place, but fight for a better future for your neighborhood. And so one of the casitas that we've been working with for a very long time in the South Bronx is Casita Rincon Criollo, which is what my colleagues, the ethnomusicologist Dr. Roberta Singer and folklorist Elena Martinez call a traditional context for the transmission of tradition. It's one of the city's oldest and largest casitas. It is a center of Puerto Rican bomba and plena, which are separate but related music and dance traditions. It is as all casitas are, it's not just a space, it's a cultural landscape. It's a living cultural landscape. It's a place where people garden. It's a place where people come together to relax and enjoy and recreate. It's a place where people pass on culturally specific traditions. It is a place where people come together for mutual aid and self-reliance, and also for political organizing. And Rincon Criollo has had to move in the sort of, you know, ever-present competition for limited space in New York City. The debate between affordable housing and public open space is ongoing. And so in 2006, Rincon Criollo was displaced from its original location to another location just about a block away in the Melrose neighborhood of South Bronx, where it continues to thrive. It continues to serve as a living, what in historic preservation we call a traditional cultural property, which, unlike sort of regular or more common nominations to places like to the National Register of Historic Places, have bounded periods of significance. This is ongoing. Traditional cultural properties are ongoing. And you can see it's everything from dance and music and gathering to foodways to decoration. And we have been doing a study of casitas. One time there were about 100 that, you know, went up and came down all across these neighborhoods in New York City, neighborhoods that the city had divested from, that were the victims of planned shrinkage, that were the victims of contagious housing destruction, that were places that the city chose to forget, and the communities who lived there chose to lift them up, to reappropriate these spaces, to see that there's never nothing there, and to make these places work for them, to redevelop them in ways that were empowering and spaces of joy. And so they take many different forms, as you can see all across the city. And again, they're not just buildings, they're cultural landscapes for living communities. And this is a documentation study that was done in the late 1980s by Martha Cooper and folklorist Joseph Sciorra and historic preservationist Nancy Solomon. Martha Cooper is a fantastic photographer, took hundreds of photos of casitas, and you can see them really activated here as social spaces, as connection spaces. These are part of a tangle across New York City. There are spaces of all different kinds of activities that are both really specifically traditional, that are aspirational, and that are, again, very everyday poetry, the poetry of everyday life. And in this project, I have been doing oral histories with as many casitas as are interested in participating as I can. And this project really got going in 2016. And to come back to thinking about these as really fragile typologies, by the time we got going, from the 100 that had existed in the 80s, only about 30 were left. And so you see here Villa Puerto Rico, which was located in the South Bronx. I love this photograph, sort of aerial shot of this activated space, the space that, again, many people would have said there's nothing there, but of course there's so much there. It's a container for so much kind of life activity, and so many knowledge ways, and so much kinetic and potential energy. And this space really made it, as you can see from this image, 2007, Can see it there 2009, can see it there still in 2011, and then as of 2014, it's gone. And this is a space also that was a space of representation, a space of social capital in the absence perhaps of financial capital. And then it became, was redeveloped as housing. And in the beginning of this project, as I said, in November 2016, in fact, on November 7th, 2016, I visited a casita in East Harlem, asking about the origins of the casita, trying to figure out why this, the shapes and the sort of specific features were chosen for this one, and came to speak to the founder, a gentleman who was telling me all about his career. He's a native East Harlemite, his career as a working in hospitals, as a therapist, working with children, a painter. As you can see, a lot of the artwork that he had students produce over the years is painted on the casita and on these panels. And it came, the conversation evolved, and I said, so why did you found the casita? And he said, well, I'm a resident here for a very long time, and my neighbors and I used to play dominoes at folding tables and folding chairs on the street. And in the early 90s, we started to be harassed by the police. And so this lot was vacant, it was abandoned, and I decided I would make this, a refuge for my community to gather. We continue to play dominoes there, and in the interior, and to have this sort of boundary of, it's a public space, it's a publicly owned property, but this boundary of a fence and a sort of a threshold that you cross where there's sort of community control, community representation, and this connection, the social connection that helps to keep each other safe. And why did he make this casita? Well, his son was one of the youngest members of, or one of the youngest to be convicted as a member of or as one of the young men in the Central Park Five. And he created this space sort of as a result of that to create a sanctuary in what we are now supposed to be considering a sanctuary city. And as you recall, Donald Trump at that time, shortly after the young men were arrested, took out a full-page ad in 4 of the main newspapers, spent I think about $80,000 of his own money, a real estate mogul at that time, asking to bring back the death penalty in response to this case. And it really exacerbated already extant, already endemic, already deep-seated racial tensions, racial profiling, racism, discrimination, media frenzy, and anger, and you use the word hate many times against these young men. Who we know served anywhere from 6 to 13 years in prison. They were all ages 14 to 16. And it wasn't until 2002 that the actual perpetrator of the crime and assault and rape against a woman in Central Park came forward and claimed responsibility. And it was in fact verified that his DNA matched that at the site. And not until 2014 that the men were able to win a civil case against the city of New York and then later the state of New York. And in that time, Donald Trump refused to, to apologize, to reflect on his experience and his engagement with this case, and continued to do so through his political campaign and even until today. But this is really an incredible example of the kinds of this way that people need public space, public open space, the ways that people in New York City use and optimize and rely upon and create safe havens, as Matthew mentioned. These ruptures in the city and the cityscape, as Mindy was talking about, are reinvented, reimagined, reappropriated, and become the most valuable, most essential kinds of places in New York City. Thank you.
So much, Molly. Matthew, we're going to go back to you to talk about how do these experiences and these tools take us forward to unleash the power of the city to heal us all. What you got?
One of the things that I really loved that Molly said was, some of these different spaces essentially being the venues for the poetry of everyday life. And one of the first things that I thought of was, you know, who are the poets? Where are they writing? You know, to me, all of the people that participate in these works or that participate at these venues are all the poets that are writing. It's really like wonderful, you know, tapestry that makes up all of the things that make that space in that particular area really wonderful. And one of the things that I really try and do is create what Molly was talking about by doing ephemeral works that mark space. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about how, you know, in what way I do that personally. And one of that ways is by creating environments that can exist that didn't exist before in a space that is seemingly not a great spot. This particular tunnel through the 14th Street, 6th Avenue subway station between the L train and the F and the M and the 123 is a great example of a space that people think there's nothing in. But there's people in there, and there's space, and there's an environment that's actually quite rich and diverse for people to be able to come together and share that poetry of everyday life with each other. I set this up for the tables like $40. The sticky notes are another, you know, $20 or $40, depending on, you know, how long I'm going to be there. You know, I was doing this project for 3 days, and essentially as a solo individual, I can come out with my kit, which is a folding table, a folding chair, and sticky notes, pens, now hand sanitizer, and you know, gloves if I'm going to be doing things. And you know, these are ways that anybody could go and do this stuff. I would encourage anybody to do it anywhere. This was for the International Day of Happiness. Again, I flew on a plane with my little kit of tools. I didn't have to buy anything special or do anything. And I think that I don't, to use the example of the elephants, I don't necessarily know if like I'm an elephant or if my work is kind of this migrating elephant that goes from place to place. But certainly you can, at least for me as an individual who is walking dogs and bartending and really just wanted to be there for my community, I can do these things. I can go and create these spaces in public space and in private space too. You know, since my project's gone viral and I've, you know, published a few books, people know my work and they call me when things happen. There was a school where there was a stabbing and it was super tragic. And one of the teachers there reached out and said, hey, our students are reeling. 200 young people watched someone get stabbed in front of them, and we are not really sure how to handle the situation. And so I was like, yeah, let's figure it out. Here's my toolkit. This is a way for you to be able to heal the individuals in this community so that they can share a piece of themselves and connect. And the simplicity, like, is really the important part about that. It's recreatable, it's scalable, you can do it. And certainly I think that things like this should exist in a lot of different ways. These are just a few things that I've created, but there are other projects like Candy Chang comes to mind with the Before I Die walls, if you've seen them. Brandon Doman is a really wonderful artist that does the Strangers Project in Washington Square Park that some of you might have seen. An artist named Coco Van does a project called The World Letter, where she invites people to write different things. And all of these are projects that use different prompts in order to, you know, extract or encourage people to really release in a specific space to create those moments of connection and those moments of community. And so this is another project I designed with Dean Haddock and Thomas Reintjes, just two really wonderful individuals that are part of a team that's now transitioned to an audio platform called PeoplePhone. We do different works in public space like this that invite people to share a piece of themselves. Ultimately, my work started, 4 years ago with a question. It was, how do people feel better about the stuff that they feel bad about? And so in creating this work, I really wanted to explore, what is it that somebody keeps inside and how do they feel better about that stuff? And, people line up. I don't do this project now because I'm figuring out how to do different projects that are very tactile and in person amidst COVID-19. But, for like both of these projects, really, I created, aside from my time and energy, for like less than like $200. Subway Therapy, less than $100, like had 50,000 people posting on sticky notes around the nation. And this project has hundreds of people that have called in and just tens of hours of time in public space. There's a line all the time. And so it really makes me believe that if individuals and organizations have the desire to create these essential places, there's just a lot of venue for them. There's just so much space that is not necessarily underutilized, but it's like the ground floor that we can build on. And there's a lot of that space. There's so many vacant spaces in New York that can be revitalized, or things can be added to those spaces in the windows or in the fronts. And then, we can think really inventively about how do we as a society, as individuals, organizations, as companies, create complex and interesting solutions for some of the worst problems that our society faces in the future. And so definitely, this should be a time lapse, but it's okay. Definitely my takeaway from all of the conversation that we've been having is, how do we really, figure out what essential elements create the environment for connection, for catharsis, for community? And then how do we really do an effective job of inserting objects like this? How do we get artists to create the venue for the poetry that can like host the poetry of everyday life? These are all things that I think about often and would love to see so much more of in the coming future.
Much, Matthew. That is very, very inspirational. The idea that for $100 you can get all of New York to talk about how it feels about the presidential election. Amazing. Molly, want to join us? And I think we can open it up for discussion, and we can take comments from the audience. So if people have questions, put them in the chat, and we'll see what we can tackle. But while we're waiting for questions, Molly, anything you want to say, or Matthew, anything you want to say, a question you want to pose to get us started?
One of the things that I saw in the chat that I was really interested in earlier on was someone said, I feel like I'm looking for direction and how to move forward and feeling an intense lack of distrust in our leaders. How do we make wise decisions in a time of uncertainty? I've been sort of
simple
talking about it, and certainly I think agency comes to mind. That like, even though there's a lot of uncertainty and thinking about wise decisions, there's certainly, for me, I have like this personal, I'm just going for it, and I'm just looking for solutions, and I'm trying to find them, and I'm trying things in public space. And I don't necessarily recommend that for everyone, but I don't know. I just think I listen and I have conversations with strangers, and I put myself in places where I can have these conversations that allow me to think about what forward means and how to do it. And so that's what came to mind for me.
How about you, Molly? And thinking about that question.
You're on mute.
I think you're on mute.
It's how do we find trust? How do we find a way forward? How do we come together in terms of trust, right? That's the main question.
In a time of uncertainty,
Yeah.
How do we know what to do?
I think in a lot of ways, tradition and community gathering. It has a lot of community healing and a lot of centuries and almost millennia of wisdom that have come down through sort of these like pulse points that we have in the calendar. And what's really unfortunate is, and what was very sort of just both beautiful and disheartening in April and May when we were getting these nominations for central places, and a number of them were spiritual centers or religious institutions where people were hoping to celebrate Easter together or Passover together, which takes place more commonly in people's homes, but couldn't do it. They just couldn't come together. And the hope and the sort of the optimism around these pulse points that we have created as a civilization across the calendar were inaccessible because of our separation. And Zoom and Google Meets and Google Hangout and all of the various platforms that we were able to use to have some version of that were helpful, but you couldn't hug anyone and you couldn't mourn together. Still can in a lot of circumstances. Things like funerals or births. But I think that knowing that many cultures have responses. There are sort of culturally specific responses in a lot of cases. A lot of the communities we work with heal themselves collectively and individually in very specific ways, and I think there's a lot to be said for that. I mean, not across the board, I'm assuming, but and a lot of these public spaces are opportunities for us to do that. But yeah, it's a really complicated question. How do you move forward in a time of such distrust and anxiety? It's a good question.
Yeah, and it's very complicated. And that's why, to me, as a social psychiatrist, collective recovery has been such a important concept, one that my research team worked out after 9/11, because some of the stuff you do, Matthew, you can't actually, if you go to the subway, there's not a crowd there. You probably shouldn't go to the subway, but there's certainly not a crowd. So how do you move things in a time like this? And organizations are in motion. I mean, MAS did the Jane's Walk. MAS did this. So organizations are in motion, and you could go through the whole list of organizations, and they're all doing things. And so the issue is, how do they collaborate? And organizations are very capable of collaborating in the virtual environment. And so that's helpful. And the other thing is, organizations know experts. I mean, if my organization doesn't, somebody else's organization does. So it becomes a way of bringing together people who are leaders, who are committed to say, and getting them to sift through and then collectively make a decision about how shall we move forward. So it's a very powerful way to, in this particular moment of such crisis, such failure of leadership, who can lead. And it's really the organizations that have to step up to the plate, but they can do it. There's plenty of experts out here telling us it's not rocket science what we have to do. It's just who has the power, and organizations have a lot of power. So that's my 2 cents on that. And the other thing is that people are feeling very discouraged because of this pileup of disasters. Say we get through COVID, guess what? Climate change. So we're going to be jumping out of the vat into the fire. So the more we can create connections among our organizations, the better off we're going to be. Matthew, did you see another question you'd like to answer?
Actually, I kind of want to be selfish and ask you a question about elephants.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I guess my curiosity is this, I understand conceptually that elephants are places that bring people that life in an environment or joy or whatever it is that they need in that specific city. It's like a place, a beloved place or a gathering place, whatever it is. I'm wondering, do you think that people can also be elephants? Or is that just not, scale-wise, is it too small? I mean, performance artists come to mind, or like really incredible characters in New York that give, you see them walking by. There was a guy in Prospect Park who went by and he was balancing a soccer ball on his head while riding a bicycle. And then he was making this really crazy sound as he was doing it. And you know, it just, I love people. And so when I see these people, I'm like, that's the elephant, like, you know, going by me that makes this whole environment feel like a really magical place. So, you know, I was curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, when like geographers talk about place, it's always people and space. So they're never separate. So part of it is, you know, where's the space where you're going to see the crazy guy going by? Because there are spaces where you're more likely to see the guy on the bicycle with the soccer ball on his head, and those are the places that become the elephants, right? But it's the conjunction of the two. But really, it's about space-time moments is a place, and it's not the performance artist per se. It's sort of the milieu in which he's going to do his thing is the elephant. But that doesn't mean that these animators of public space, like you, like that guy with the bicycle and the soccer ball, are crucial actors. And especially when people have been divided, when they're mad at each other, when they don't know how to talk to each other, you become the bridge builders. So you're in a divided, fractured, frightened, misguided society, you're crucial. Think of yourself as a tailor.
Sure. So I think
mending.
I feel really comfortable filling in that role. I guess one of my curiosities too is, you know, I you know, was possessed or was channeling the spirit or however you want to call it. But I really wonder how, I mean, some of the work that I do through Art Plus People is just to help other people do the things that I do. But I'm wondering if actually either one of you, you know, there are these individuals that end up doing these things. Like, how does one, I have an answer for this, but I'm wondering from both of your perspectives, you know, how does one become activated and become one of those people that can turn a space into an elephant wherever they live, in any community that they're in?
Molly, you want to take that? I mean, certainly casitas are people doing that.
That's a great question. I think, you know, I am not an artist, so I think of myself as a great appreciator of makers and doers and the folks like you who bring us all together. But I think, you know, thinking about in times of distrust or not, or it's like having optimism and showing people a way to have some kind of optimism and identifying agency. What I think people feel in this moment is powerless. And that's not true. Or they were feeling that in March, April, and May. And then we have really seen how powerful people are as of June, July, and August, and the way that people have taken to the streets. They have pressed for the repeal of so many oppressive, discriminatory laws related to the police force, related to voting, related to all kinds of systems. There's so much more work to do, but people really went from fear and distrust and not knowing how to act or what if they could act to knowing they had to act. And I don't know. I don't consider myself one of those people, but certainly you are. And giving people a space to just put their ideas out on paper in front of everyone else, to say, we can do this. Look at mine plus yours plus 20,000 of us. We can do it. That, I think, is really how you activate those spaces.
That was great, Molly. I think but just to go back to the person, because I loved your point about people just pouring into the streets to protest. So such an important part of this. But people make statements in very, very many ways. Cantal took me to a city in France called Perpignan, and he was working to connect the housing projects to the city, to the flow of the city. And in this one housing project, which is really disconnected from the city, and the only thing that was there was a pharmacy. And he was so proud of the pharmacist because she made a beautiful window. So this is a despised, marginalized housing project full of North Africans and other people that the French don't like. But this pharmacist showed her pride in her space and made it welcoming and gorgeous. So each of us can do that. And so that's the thing about that I like to think, and I was really glad to see one of my students is here. Hi, Mariana. If I could teach anything, I would teach everybody. You're an urbanist, and you help make the city. And Molly, you are certainly an urbanist, and you help make the city. And you might not be an artist, but you are an urbanist. You're a great urbanist. So keep doing it. What you got next, Molly, Matthew?
One of the things I think was so powerful about the casita in East Harlem is seeing opportunity, the real manifestation of agency, but also seeing opportunity to create a wall, even if it's not property that you own, to have a building there and use that as a marquee, which is, thinking about the Williamsburg Bridge or the fence around the private property in Williamsburg, or, public murals, even projections. I mean, that projections have become such a huge part of protest culture in the last few years anyway, but to see that as a marquee, as a space where you can put Central Park 5 innocent and then later exonerated, and know that is a way you can build strength and find hope and
Totally.
control of the moment. That to me, really, that little action of that is just so powerful. So that's it's as much as stringing words and saying I am here that I think makes a big difference.
Yes, no question about it. It's very, very powerful, and it's something all of us can do. I work with a group in Orange, Healthy Orange Coalition, and we made some yard signs. And our yard sign says, "Turn on the love." And we're all in this together in English, Spanish, and Haitian Creole. So I have a yard sign. One of the things that is about this, that Matthew, when you go out and there are crowds in the street and you call people to action, call them to write something. One of the things that you and Molly and I had a chance to talk about as we were preparing for today was the extent to which they were really prophetic, many of the things that people said, that that they laid out a path that we are on now. And what would you say we've learned about that path, of both from our fears and our call to love?
Ooh. Okay. So oh man, one of the really interesting echoes from that time, one of the first notes that I remember seeing that I was really, really moved by as someone who is really interested and invested in education and public programs and things of that nature. There was a note of someone that said, I'm having such a hard time talking to my 9-year-old. Every morning she wakes up and she's scared and she asks me for help and to help her understand what's going on, but I don't entirely understand what's going on. And so it's difficult for me to understand what I should be talking to her about. And that has been an incredibly fascinating seed that has really come to fruition in my mind throughout all these different experiences where there's a lack of understanding, or there's a lack of cohesive leadership, or there's a lack of coming together of a community to support each other. I mean, so many people are individual or isolated, or really invested in this capitalist understanding of, I have to do all this stuff on my own, and I have to do all these things, and I need to know all the answers for my child, and I need to do all these things. And so when I look at that play out in the context of today, after George Floyd's death, and all these people sort of reeling, and then, you know, some people kind of shying away, and some people stepping forward, and people doing the wrong things and getting chastised, people doing the right things. But, you know, just there's all these different ways that people are trying to understand, like, what to do and how to do it, and how to contextualize that for a younger audience. And then you have COVID-19, the larger pandemic, which is on top of all of that stuff.
Yep.
And I think, aside from all the outpouring of love, which we see almost in any instance, in New York in particular, but in many places around the world, you have people show up for each other in a variety of different ways. But the pandemic made it very difficult to do that. And so you didn't have the normal, like, I would say the path that I saw before was coming together and expressing yourself is a great idea. It helps the city feel supported. That's a good thing. It made New York able to heal and think about what was going on for the 2016 election. It made people crystallize their ideas so that they could then act. But now we don't have that environment anymore. That path of love and support has altered. And so I think for me, that question is something I think about a lot, of how to really provide an environment where there's really good information, where education can occur easily, where parents are prepared to support other families. And so that, you know, and these solutions, they're still missing, which is one of the biggest problems that we have as a nation, and probably as a world in general. It's just, you know, there are these structures, there's these systems, information systems or design systems that we just haven't really created yet. It was really wonderful technology. All the space is there. Like you were saying, everything that we need is here. It's around us. And we still haven't figured it out. And so that's sort of, to me, the path forward is that. All of the notes that I've ever read are, you know, on this path towards evolution of our society. And we just need to use all of the nourishment and the material that we have around us in order to do that. You know, that's my answer.
It's profound, Matthew, because we're a divided society and we don't know how to pool our knowledge and make a better world. Where I live in New Jersey is half a mile away from Thomas Edison's Factory of Invention, which a place I love to take people from out of town. I like to just go there. So he wanted to invent things, but he wanted to make a lot of inventions. And so he made a factory to make inventions. So the factory to make inventions had a movie studio, it had a chem lab, it had a big machine shop, it had a little machine shop. And so all these people were thinking all the time together. Now, Thomas Edison was very anti-Semitic, and he had this huge fight over whether we should be AC or DC, right? So he was kind of embattled kind of man. So even he, much as he understood that we had to think together, couldn't really be open. And that is kind of the dilemma. We could be Thomas Edison, but we don't exactly want to be Thomas. We want to be better than Thomas Edison. And how do we bring people together to invent? Molly, I think the casitas are places of invention. By the way, a colleague of mine who was very big in community gardens in the Bronx, when Kental came to visit, took us to a casita, and they're like, "Oh, you're from France, you have to taste our wine." Kental's a big expert on wine. And he said, "Well, it wasn't very good wine, but it was a really great place to be."
Nice.
What do you think about casitas as factories of invention? Not just preservation, but invention.
Yeah, so what keeps coming to mind, and I apologize, this isn't an entirely fully formed thought, is there's a a Caribbean proverb or saying, really, excuse me, that basically suggests that people in the Caribbean live on the edge of an eyelash. And the idea with that is really about, I think on surface level, it's about the ecology, right? The environment of hurricanes and storms and erosion of land and all of that. So meaning that it's so delicate, like an eyelash. And you have to be able to be hardy enough to live in this very delicate ecosystem. But I think that if you think about it on another level or on many other levels, it's because uncertainty is permanent, and because everyone lives on the edge of an eyelash, we're all equally vulnerable. You have to come up with ways of being creative together collectively, and that when the hurricane comes, it's not just coming and raining on one person's house. It's coming and knocking everybody's house down, sucking down all the infrastructure, and it impacts everybody when the earthquake comes. And I think, you know, casitas are tropical architecture, vernacular architecture. I've heard from a number of people that that actually the way that the nails are used or even not used or hammered in is so that the roof can blow off and the structure doesn't fly away. And they are elevated so that the water doesn't seep in and rot the floor, but also because people who built casitas in Puerto Rico, for the most part, were not people who had ownership, land ownership. So they were literally picking them up and rolling them to the next place and creating new casita communities sort of on the peri-urban zone as you know, the Puerto Rico became a territory of the United States and the entire economy was shifted because of big industry that the United States imposed. The way that the sort of distribution across the landscape shifted. And these sort of almost squatter communities, but these casita communities around city centers sort of sprang up. And that tradition was moved to New York City. I mean, that's really like living on the edge of an eyelash. Like, things are always in flux. Puerto Rican communities who are, you know, Puerto Ricans have been citizens of the United States in 1917. It's a community that for a long time was going back and forth. And so finding ways to navigate that very different, you know, landscapes, political realities, economic realities, cultural realities, of course, you become, I think there's a way of becoming both flexible and also communal. And casitas are really about that. It's that, you know, the casitas that I am aware of, the ones that have survived, which was not necessarily true of all of them, and to a large degree, the non-survival rate and specific incidences that are beyond the control of the community themselves. But the coming together to save these casitas, to put them up, to clear out garbage-strewn lots, to plant, to build. When people burned, you know, the Rincon Criollo that I showed as the one example that we're really close to and working with, was burnt down by arsonists several times before the sort of structure that we came to know as the structure in the original site. People came and built it back again. It's living on an edge of an eyelash. You, and what I think COVID has, you know, many people have said, it has exposed that there's no amount of money you can throw at COVID. There's no wealth, there's no privilege. There are ways in which privilege can, that protects people, and that, you know, low-income communities, communities of color have been disproportionately affected because of privilege, absolutely. But as a virus, we're all equally potentially susceptible to it. And the way that people see that's, you know, that may be with economics and politics and medical systems as they are, it's all on an eyelash. We have to figure out how to stabilize through each other. And I think that's something I keep thinking about in terms of all of this. So
that was really beautifully said. And I wanted to say that one of the people that in our that the team that worked together to think about, to sort of figure out collective recovery, was Dr. Lourdes Rodriguez, who's Puerto Rican. So brings a lot of that communal spirit. She's always saying to us, you know, we want organizations to step up and do this work, but we can't add to their work. We just have to make it part of what they already do. We can't put a new something on their plate. And the main thing we can tell organizations, if somebody has a good idea, copy it. So you two are full of good ideas, and many organizations that care about the city should just be copying what you have to say. It's, according to my computer, 5:55, and I wondered, maybe Matthew, you have, and Molly and I, we could just have a very short closing thought and then turn it back to Elizabeth.
Sure. I just want to say that if anyone would like to have a conversation about making the world a better place or about doing public programs, education, all these different things, I do a variety of different works that provide some of the elements that I've been talking about in different spaces. Recently, I created a really wonderful project with a collaborator named Vridi Saraf, who's just an incredible collaborator called Virtually Human. It's virtuallyhumanproject.com. If you want to go check that out, it has a bunch of different elements of human engagement so that we can bring some of these essential human elements into online gatherings and things of that nature. I think we can create elephants online, right? So
We can.
so that's,
we can.
you know,
Yeah.
there are things like that that I'm creating and interested in collaborating with people on. So if you're interested in developing something like that, audience, I'm happy to help you accomplish that. Feel free to reach out to me. I'm putting in the chat now a great way to connect with me. You can do it on Instagram at Subway Therapy, or there's a contact form at subwaytherapy.com, or you can reach out to me via email at Subway Therapy. One thing that I do every week is a collective journal. If you guys click on the link here, I do a collective community journal. If you've clicked on it, you're on the home page. There's a tab called COVID-19. If you go to it, there's a COVID-19 community journal. If you're into Harry Potter, it's like a pensieve, a place that we can magically store our thoughts and memories and maybe do something with them later, or look back, or show them in museums, whatever it is. And my question of the week is, how do you make others feel included in your community? And that's a question I got from members from The Door. It's a nonprofit that I'm a teaching artist at that provides services and opportunity for underserved individuals in New York who are younger, between 14 and 24. So yeah, just feel free to connect with me. I would love to chat and explore, and yeah, that's me.
Awesome. How about you, Molly?
Urge you all to nominate places to the Census of Places That Matter. MAS and City Lore are continuing to collect this information. Let us know what you care about and why, and what kinds of places you're relying on now. And these can be all different kinds of ways. It could be the street corner, it could be your own stoop, it could be a store, it could be a place of memory, as unfortunately a lot of places in the city landscape are rapidly becoming. But please let us know, because this project is ongoing and I think there's a lot to be learned from it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Molly. Yeah, I just want to say that, I'll put that in the chat, that University of Orange, we believe every organization has a role to play in getting us through this, and then being together so that we can tackle the next crises. If we're going into a pileup of disasters, we're going to have to do it together in that communal spirit. I loved Molly's living on an island, on the edge of an island. Imagine that, not even living on the eyelash, living on the edge of the eyelash. We are in trouble. We need each other. So the question that we've put out is that each of us can ask our organizations, what's ours to do? And so I ask you, what for your organization, what part of this recovery is yours to do? If we do it together, we might make it. Elizabeth, I just want to say, for me, it's been great to be with you, Matthew and Molly. I've enjoyed all the organizing meetings and this today. It's been a lot of fun. And Elizabeth, thank you so much for inviting me. And I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you. I'm saying thank you.
Thank our speakers enough. They're provocative and fascinating. We walk away with metaphors of elephants and eyelashes, but with an enduring sense that we have an obligation to each other to heal the incredible societal divisions that we're living with at the moment. So thank you to all of you. And thank you to our audience for joining us today. We are so thankful that you took the time to spend a little bit of time with us and these thoughtful speakers. We are so thankful if you have enjoyed this program. We hope you'll join MAS. It is the thing that keeps us going and allows us to produce these wonderful programs for you. So thank you very much, and I hope you will all have a wonderful evening. Good night.